Okay, excellent. So this is a fun topic, and it really should be an interesting one because it is about engagement and really maximizing engagement through visualization. So um, without further ado, I'll get into it and introduce myself. I'm the Director of Corporate Development at Chaos, and Chaos is a visualization company that includes Chaos, which is well known for its V-Ray software, Enscape, real-time visualization, which is the sponsor of this particular webinar, and then also Celinda, which does very high-quality assets for the purposes of, say, e-commerce, particularly around furniture and furniture design. So what do I do in the context of corporate development at Chaos? Well, the biggest thing that I do is keep my eye out at what's happening in the industry and what's happening in the industry from the perspective of our competitors, from all of our users and customers, and also from the perspective of the various industry activities and organizations, and then fold that into the planning, strategic planning on the part of our company, whether it comes down to new products, new investments, new partnerships. So it's a really exciting role, and is one in which gives me the opportunity also to directly engage with all of our users through webinars like this. Of course, the value of these webinars is not only the type of research that I get to do in generating those webinars, but also in hearing the comments, the feedback, and the challenging questions that the audience usually poses. So I'm going to save a little bit of time at the end and really encourage all of you to think about any questions you might have and put them in there. And of course, if we're not able to respond to them in the webinar itself, we always like to go back through afterwards and pull out the ones that really deserve us to reach out to you afterwards and to follow up in particular. So engagement in design. Easy to say, but I want to say that perhaps more than anything, this overall presentation is actually intended to be a demonstration of engagement. So hopefully I'm able to fulfill on that particular promise. But one of the things I want to do is perhaps a little bit different from the norm is actually have your phones ready. Throughout this presentation, we've made a concerted effort to provide a lot of resources for you to directly engage. So they'll all be present as QR codes that you can scan. Some of those QR codes will take you to visualization so you can engage with visual experiences on your own and with your own device. But additionally, we've also provided a lot of citations, various links to new resources and things like that. So this is something where you can actually capture a lot of data out of this presentation itself through direct engagement. So making good on the title directly through the format of the content itself. So engagement. What exactly do we mean by engagement? And I think there's a lot of different ways that this could be conceived of in the context of a design process. So I guess by virtue of the fact that I'm the one that created this webinar, I can define what I meant by engagement. And in this particular case, I think we can all agree that engagement is really about the participation of divergent voices in the design process itself. And one of the things that I've always enjoyed most about the design process, the fact that there really are inherently a wide variety of different stakeholders. You obviously have the design professionals that come in a lot of different flavors, whether it be the architects, the engineers, the various consultants, maybe the contractors, things like that. But then you also have a number of stakeholders. Those may include the end users, those that are, say, if it's an institutional project, the patrons of the art, if you will, or those that are funding the project. You might actually have, say, student housing, people that be living in the project, or if it's a neighborhood, those that live in the neighborhood that will be affected by the project. And when you think of all these different voices, all of them have something to add to the design process, something to contribute to the decision-making process. And if they make those contributions, it can yield a better overall design. So when I say engagement, and how do you get all of those stakeholders really engaged in the design process, it's a two-part equation. So not to make this sound like this is overly formalized, but the way I conceived of it is to have engaged stakeholders and really even engaged designers in the design process, is that you both need to have comprehension. You need to have understanding of information that's being presented, but then you also need to have excitement. And you put those two things together and you have engagement. So when I think about all the participants in a design process, if they don't really understand a design, they're not in a position to form opinions. But if they do understand it, they'll be able to internalize that design, think about it, form opinions. But a lot of times just having an opinion isn't enough. You actually need to have that opinion. You want to share that opinion. And that's where the excitement comes in. Because when people are excited, you get a group of people around a table that are all sharing ideas, excitedly talking. All of a sudden, those ideas start to build upon each other. And people want to contribute. They want to add their piece to that overall design process. So when we think about engagement and we think about what we're trying to show you through this presentation, it's all ways of improving that comprehension, improving that understanding, and with it also building excitement. And the end result is that people are going to be engaged and actually contribute to the design process itself. So let's start with that first part, comprehension. It's easy to say, well, everything we're doing is really simple from a perspective of a designer. But part of that is that design professionals have been using certain tools for communication within their profession that require a certain amount of training and experience to even interpret. So if you were to show someone a floor plan or a section drawing that isn't a design professional or hasn't seen that type of interface, you're going to get a lot of question marks because that's not the way that people have grown to see the world. So you're going to end up not having that comprehension that's so necessary for engagement. But there is an easy solution, and that's visualization. And when we say visualization, in this case, you're taking those types of say, design documentation type visuals, those plans and section views, the BIM models and things like that, and then converting it into a format that reflects what people are used to seeing in the everyday world. And the benefit is, of course, that all those stakeholders and end users have had training their whole life on how to interpret visual data. You have, every time you open your eyes, essentially you're interpreting visual data, and you're interpreting it and absorbing it at an incredibly fast rate. So that's a really effective way of having a single medium by which the design professionals and the stakeholders can communicate together, building that comprehension. So we're going to take you through in this presentation essentially different ways in which you can create visual mediums that allow for increased engagement. So from our perspective, virtual reality, assets and entourage, 3D data experience, and gamification are all different ways in which we need to be able to share information that is incredibly important to the design process. But each one of these technologies and tools offers ways in which you can actually increase engagement significantly. So saying that is one thing, but we wanted to do was provide a slightly different way of making that argument. So we're going to start with each one of these showing an example from research. Maybe not all of it directly focused on people, but ones that show ways in which information is processed essentially by the brain or by, say, collective groups through actual studies. And then to provide an example of what that might actually look like, leveraging our software, Enscape, and then a case study. And in this particular case, these case studies are pulling from various client examples that we have or customer examples that we have, taking those examples and reformatting them in such a way that we don't have to worry about sharing confidential product information or anything like that, but showing how they actually used Enscape in ways to say improve that engagement through visualization, and through visualization that relates to these 4 categories. So it's going to be a pretty interesting exercise. And as I warned all of you at the beginning, have your phones ready. There'll be a lot of opportunities to scan information and ideally take this and incorporate this into your own practice. So let's start with design engagement in VR. So coming from a research example, one of the big questions is VR actually a reasonable facsimile for, say, experiencing the real world? And we found research that indicated that exploring space using VR can be as understandable and, in fact, as engaging as if you were to actually be going out in the real world. And I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg loves to hear this. And of course, there's always going to be a gap between VR and the real world. But there's some really interesting research showing that actually that gap between VR and the true physical world is smaller at least from an emotional perspective, than one would think. So a really interesting study that was done by some researchers that must have very gentle hands and an enormous amount of patience was taking rats, and you're actually seeing a video right here of an actual rat in a VR setup. So it's essentially a gimbal that's attached to their head and a little trackpad that the rat is running around on. And what they did is they tracked a rat through a VR space. And when that part of that tracking was both how they moved, but also what neurons were firing as they moved around this space. And they conducted this experiment both in a virtual environment and in an actual physical environment. And what they found is that the rats' brains fired in a similar fashion, the neurons that were activated in a very similar fashion in both the VR space and in an actual physical space, indicating that from your brain's perspective, navigating a VR environment actually has the same type of sort of neurological effect as if you were navigating a true physical environment, which is pretty remarkable. Maybe not as remarkable as creating that whole setup for the rat, but I have to say that sounds like a pretty great experience for that little rat being able to crawl around in that particular environment. So if we take that particular piece of research and we couple it with another piece of research that was done looking at the perception of scale and spatial relationships in VR, both for design professionals and for those that had no experience in design, so sort of design lay people, perhaps representing your average stakeholder in the context of a design process. And they found that for both of those groups, there was in fact a improved perception of scale and spatial relationships in VR versus traditional 2D modeling environments. So the research that was done here was one in which they created an environment in Unity, and they actually replicated an environment looking at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. They have their outdoor garden there, and they recreated that environment and offered opportunities for different audiences, both these design professionals, people that had a high level of experience modeling in 2D space, as well as lay people that had no experience modeling in 2D space or 3D space, and brought them into this environment and asked them both to make assessments on distance, relative size, and proportion, but also to engage in modeling exercises themselves. And they did this both in these 2D environments, and they did it in a 3D immersive environment via VR. And what was very interesting about this experiment is that they found that in the 3D immersive environment versus a 2D environment, that there was a much higher level of intuitive perception of scale and spatial relationships. People knew how big the place was just by looking. Whereas in the 2D screen environment, they had a difficult time judging, say, how far apart things were, how large a tree might be, how large a sculpture was. So that makes a certain amount of sense in a VR environment. You're walking in it, you're immersed in it, you can tell if something's above you or below you or whatnot. But what was particularly interesting in this experiment is they found that improved perception of scale held true both for those that had a high level of experience modeling in 2D environments and 3D environments, the design professionals, and it also held true, of course, and perhaps to a much even greater degree for those that had no design experience. So this shows that people, even if they are really comfortable operating in your traditional design tools that are used for architecture, whether, say Revit or SketchUp or Rhino, there can be still an enormous benefit by taking those environments and viewing them through a immersive view to understand that sense of distance and scale. So it doesn't mean you need to model all the time in those particular environments, but this is another tool to very rapidly understand those scalar relationships, those spatial relationships. And in fact, this is something that we see at Enscape with a lot of our customers, is that they'll have a VR headset on their desk, and they'll very quickly pop their Enscape view or model into the VR mode, pop on the headset, look around, get a sense of that type of scale, take it off, go back to modeling within their CAD platform. It's an interesting way of acknowledging that perhaps even though someone may be a design professional, they're not always viewing the model in the best way possible through the actual CAD environment to make the best design decisions. And there's another alternative layer of visualization that can be easily tied into. And this research absolutely corroborates that. So when we think about VR and spatial perception, looking both at that research and then a lot of customer conversations that we've had over the years about how people use our tool, how people use Enscape to understand their designs. One of the biggest things is the sense of presence. What is it like to actually be in a space? One can obviously use their imagination looking at a 2D drawing, even a very good 2D visualization, but it's not going to be the same as having that actual VR experience where you're actually in a room looking around. And spatial perception is a big part of that. Understanding what it's like to, say, be on a second-story mezzanine, look around and get the sense of what that vaulted ceiling might actually look like. It's very difficult to communicate that through a traditional drawing, and perhaps impossible to. But you can actually do that in VR really easily and very quickly. So that's one of the bigger benefits that we see. And then immersion. And this is one of my favorite pictures to trot out when I think about immersion, because when I look at this picture, I think of a place that it's hard to imagine perhaps a more dystopic image than this in a more dystopic environment. And yet all of these people are immersed in a VR world. Hopefully largely unaware of the actual physical environment they are in. And I think that's a great testament to the immersion capability of what VR does, is it really brings you into the design itself, completely immerses you in it in such a way that you're not aware of your current physical environment. And then interaction. Similar to that, the study that used the rat, exploring that environment and allowing their neurons to fire as they sort of engage the space. Similarly, interaction is key to that. And what a VR experience allows for someone to do is actually explore that space as they want to. So from the perspective of, say, this room, understanding it from the view that you see right now, well, you can kind of get a sense of what it's like. But you get a much better sense when you can explore from the perspective of where you want to go. So what does it look like from say, the table over in the far corner? Do you get a different view? What does it look like from, say, the balcony, looking back in? And that type of interaction is one in which it greatly improves one's sense of spatial perception, because that spatial perception doesn't just come from, say, showing multiple perspectives. It also comes from showing multiple perspectives that align with how an individual wants to explore with a space. So let's take that to an example and show you this particular drawing here. And I have to say, from this plan view, how does this space look? Do you understand the scale of it easily enough? And maybe you're a design professional and you can understand it pretty well because you know how big doors are or what the standard width of stairs might be. So you can get a sense of scale. But you can think of the non-design professional audience. They're going to look at this and I think it'll be pretty challenging for them to understand exactly what they're looking at. But maybe I can present an alternative created in the context of Enscape. So maybe you were to create, say, a VR experience, which allows a person, maybe it's curated such that they're just flying through, or maybe it's one where they can explore for themselves and they can look up, get a sense of the overall height of that space, see people within that space, and get a sense of scale. And so when you think about these two examples, which one do you think is going to be more engaging? Which one do you think is going to have the audience or your stakeholders look at this and they're going to have more ideas, can be more engaged in that design process, can provide a higher level of feedback? And I can say, at least from my experience, and of course you can see the QR code there, by the way. I encourage you to click that. You can have your own little pano view if you want to check that out. From my own experience, at least, the visualization is one that really brings in a lot more people to the design process. It allows them to engage that process, to form opinions and contribute to the design in a much better way than showing something that perhaps is visual more appropriate for, say, documentation or speaking amongst design professionals. So let's take that to a case study. And this is actually a really interesting one where there was a pretty high stakes at play. And the customer of ours used VR to allow their clients and the buyers that would potentially be buying the houses that were designed to better comprehend the benefits of what was actually a very complex site plan. So if we look at this particular case study, it was a mountain community. And it was a mountain community where the designer wanted to strike a challenging balance between preservation and development. And obviously those things are really antagonistic to each other. So what they did is they pursued a strategy of high density where you had all of the homes within this mountain property relatively closely aggregated so that you could have a much larger section of preserved land outside of that aggregation of homes. The challenge was, though, these were fairly high-end homes. So when they looked at the site model, and you see our little recreation here of the mountain community plan, it's pretty high density. And the developer saw this, and obviously alarm bells went off, and they thought, well, how are we going to sell these expensive homes to buyers when they want to have natural views and they want privacy? If those are the two main priorities, we can't show them this, and they're not going to believe that we're delivering natural views and privacy. And frankly, the client didn't think that the designer was going to deliver on natural views and privacy. So what the designer did is they used VR as a mechanism to allow for both the client and potential buyers to understand the design implications of this high density proposal before they had to either invest in the case of the client or buy in case of the actual eventual buyers. And just a note, as on AI is sort of everywhere. This is our AI created image for the presentation. You're only getting one, but we always like to make a note that it was edited by a human. So you can't trust AI for everything. So what did they do in this particular case study to resolve that challenge between delivering high density and the ecological benefits that came with that, but also maintaining this idea of privacy and great views that didn't have your neighbor in them? Well, what they did is they actually used VR experiences to prove that to both of those audiences. So for the client, they designed all of these houses, and they showed what the views were going to be like. And they were able to get the actual views, the actual elevations, and import those into Enscape. And what they found, of course, is when they looked through the VR, they saw they had these great views. They couldn't see the roads. They couldn't see the neighbors. And this is by virtue of carefully positioning the houses, angling them in such a way to maximize the views, but also taking advantage of all the topography on the site itself. And then, of course, when they developed the sales brochure, they put these types of QR codes right into the brochure itself so that just like you can right now, the potential buyers could scan them with their phone, they could see those views, and they could determine for themselves and see, in fact, that they didn't see all of these neighbors around them or anything like that, but in fact, they had these wonderful mountain views. And so they actually used, interestingly enough, skybox images that were taken, I think in this case, might even been taken via drones from the second or third story height, where the third story or windows would be, and then actually imported those into Enscape. So it was the actual view that the buyer would be seeing from those balconies, and creating a high level of realism for these views. So I think that's something that really went a long way to selling the client and the potential buyers. Now, obviously, this is a webinar sponsored by Enscape. So it's worth noting that when we actually created that particular visualization, we first started in Enscape version 3.4, which is the version that's currently out. And we found a great opportunity to show the benefits of Enscape 3.5. So quality isn't always something that's maybe first and foremost in people's minds when it comes to visualization, but it's something that's really important to us. And we realize how a poor quality visualization, particularly when you're trying to sell a multi-million-dollar home, can really cause some problems. Is this a design feature or is this a visualization flaw? And when you have a sales brochure that's out there, you're not going to have an architect leaning over the potential buyer's shoulder saying, don't worry, that's just something wrong with the visualization. So in this particular case, we actually show the benefits of 3.5 and improved reflectivity. So you can see this is actually a reflection in a mirror and the benefits of 3.5 versus 3.4. And this is something where these are minor improvements, but actually they go a long ways towards creating better visual outcomes that really can help sell your project, to be perfectly honest, or at the very least, limit the amount of necessary post-processing. So you can scan for yourself actually and see the difference between those two versions if you're interested. So if that's VR and the opportunities in VR, I'd like to now transition to the next one, which is about assets and design engagement. So assets, or the things that you put in your design, can be incredibly important. And one of the big reasons why they're important is they can actually have an emotional impact on those that are viewing a visualization. So while that may seem a little unusual, there's actually some interesting research proving exactly this. In 2020, some researchers created several different environments. They created basically a pair of real environments and a pair of virtual environments that included what they refer to as biophilic or natural elements and non-biophilic elements. So if you look at that top image, they have where essentially were office spaces that were real, one in which it had plants, it had outdoor views, nice natural light. And then it had one which probably had, you can't see it in the image, but, low drop ceilings, probably some fluorescent lights that flickered a little bit, sort of a very closed in, no view physical environment. And within that environment, they had people engage in various activities. But the real point of the study wasn't just to see how well, say, people did on tests and things like that, but it was actually there to measure various stress responses. So what was their heart rate like? Do they have, say, increased stress levels and things like that within these environments? And I think the research, most of us who are familiar with the concept of biophilia would know that natural environments lend themselves to people being more relaxed, having lower stress markers than elements that, or environments rather, that don't have those natural elements or non-biophilic environments. And that was proven out in this particular test. But the next level of this test was actually really interesting, where they created virtual environments that replicated those real environments. So in this case, they had a virtual office with nice views and some plantings in it. And then it also had a immersive non-biophilic office that, as you can see, has those nice drop ceilings, no outside views. And similarly, they had people engage in a variety of tasks within these two environments. And then they measured their stress levels. And in this, they found, and this part is actually, it's a little scary in some ways, but also quite interesting, that people's stress responses and the reduction of stress in those biophilic environments was the same both in the virtual environment and in the real environment. And so what this shows is that if you start to put these assets in place, these things, maybe some of these are related to views, but, plants, more natural materials, things like that, into these virtual environments or these visualizations that you're using to communicate with clients, you can actually have a degree of emotional response in the same way that you would in the real world. So if we take that research and we think about the experience that we have, both developing and selling Enscape, and then also speaking to our customers that use our software, the use of the right entourage, meaning the people, and the assets has a variety of benefits when it comes to engaging with the audience. And those are ones that relate to scale, scenario, and emotion. So when we think about scale, what we're really talking about is it allows for people to understand how large a space is. Are we talking about an 8-foot ceiling? Or are we talking about a 10 or a 12-foot ceiling? It can be really difficult to tell if you don't have reference objects like chairs or people. So that's one of the great benefits of having assets in an image. It gives that intuitive sense of space. But also, those entourage are ones in which it can make the scene just feel more natural. It's one in which people can sort of imagine themselves from an emotional level actually being in this space. They can see someone, say, walking through this space or getting coffee, and they can sort of understand, oh yeah, this seems like a place where one would sort of go walk through, get coffee, what have you. So it allows for these things to sort of close that gap between sort of imagination and that space that hopefully they'll want to occupy once it's complete. And then similar to that, you can also have the opportunity to elicit very specific emotional engagement through actual excitement by looking at particular types of assets and populating a space with very particular types of assets or people. And this is something where we also have an example of this that's been used quite successfully by our customers. So let's take that through just a little bit of an example here. And we look at a space like this and say, well, what kind of space is this? And as you can see, without assets, it's pretty hard to say what kind of space it is. Is it a undisclosed location? Is it a airport terminal waiting room, an office? It really can be almost anything. And when you start to put assets in, there's an interesting experience that can happen where you put in the wrong assets or maybe the wrong mix of assets, and you're thinking, well, why do I have a kid here eating an apple next to a dumbbell or a punching bag in a classroom, or people in workout clothes next to kids? It just doesn't make sense. And that's where picking the right assets is incredibly important, because it starts to bring cohesion to a design, but also brings people into it. So just like the right assets in this case say, oh yeah, it's a classroom and it makes sense, the wrong assets can actually bring a person out of visualization and prevent engagement. And the great thing about assets too is that they can also show the flexibility of a space as well. So maybe that wasn't a classroom, but it was actually an office space. And it's really the assets that explain that utilization and create that comfort on the part of those stakeholders about what the space is supposed to be. And through that comfort, they'll feel comfortable to engage and start to make suggestions about how the design should actually look relative to their needs. So let's look at a case study of bespoke assets. And this is actually a really interesting example used by one of our customers for very high-end clients. So he does visualizations for high-end homes, and he did something similar to this, not this exact example, for a Hollywood client. So it's someone that is quite popular in the films these days, and was building their multi-million-dollar house. And what they did is they didn't create just a standard visualization with sort of random assets populated, but they created one that had bespoke assets. They were personalized to them. So maybe this isn't actually the case, maybe that particular client, say, wore glasses. So you have glasses on the desk, or maybe you take actual pictures of their children or artwork of their children, and you put, say, the pictures in the picture frames, and you put the artwork as a screensaver on the computer. And maybe they're into bonsai trees, and so you put some of those in the background, or they won a particular prestigious award, so you have that on the shelf. Or maybe they're from Philadelphia, perchance. And so you have their respective teams there on the hats on the shelf. And so it was something where in this particular project, the client just loved it. And it really brought them into the design itself. It got them excited in a way where they actually could start to see themselves. And sometimes assets are just the right spark to bring someone into those particular environments. And actually, I can say from this particular example, I actually happened to use artwork from my daughter, and that's a picture of my son there. And when they saw this particular slide, they were incredibly engaged in this drawing and really wanted to know what was going on. So I would say it's a fun little trick, and it's a great way to bring clients into projects. And with the power of visualization, it's actually incredibly easy to do this. And so just some examples of custom assets and how to import those into your Enscape visualizations. Here's a link to a knowledge base article on exactly that. And then we also have a blog post as well that explains some particular examples of how to utilize that particular workflow. So highly encourage you to consider that as a potential option to increase engagement with your audience. So let's go to immersive data experiences. And this is one that hadn't really occurred to us as an important tool for engagement until we really started to examine the role of data in the contemporary design process. And we found that data is absolutely everywhere, of course, when it comes to developing or designing and delivering a modern building. I mean, obviously BIM, building information modeling, data is a big part of what we're dealing with. And some of our customers were struggling with how do they actually create a more engaging experience with data. And what we found by looking into the research is that there are different ways of presenting information. And the traditional methodology of one of, let's say, just looking at a 2D data set, an Excel spreadsheet being the classic example, can be a little dry. And that immersive viewing of data can actually improve contextual understanding and also engagement. So a research example of that where it was done where they took a fairly complex data set and presented it both from a 2D perspective, but then also provided multiple ways of immersive engagement. Some being with an iPad where you could, say, have the data that was sort of augmented reality experience on a table. Other ones where it was more of a VR type experience where you could see the data sort of in 3D and interact with it. And what they found is that users not only greatly enjoyed engaging with the data through these immersive experiences as sort of a novel experience, but they also actually had an improved understanding of the data itself. And so this was an interesting example of ways in which you can take something that might be quite dry and make it more interesting. So what we found in speaking to some of our customers is they are actually doing exactly this in the context of, say, an RFP response. How are they, say, presenting data? Maybe it was just in a spreadsheet, but they also would provide ways in which that data could be engaged through an immersive experience. So a scannable QR code that could allow for people to view the data through, say, an AR experience. So let's look at this as an example. This is some delightful architectural billing index data. Very important data, I think, for many of us on the call here that are tracking the industry. Want to know how should we prepare for the future. And we look at this and say, well, is this exciting? It's like, well, I don't know. Maybe if you're really worried about this data, but it's also pretty dry. It's a lot of numbers. So alternatively, how is this? Is this an improvement? Is this just a new way? Maybe it's the same data. I guess it is the same data. So maybe it's not necessarily something completely different, but it's something that's novel. It's unusual. And through that, it has a higher level of engagement. And perhaps from this visual also, you can derive more rapid conclusions, like say, well, geez, mixed use development's on the rise. Maybe we should be switching over to that from, say, investing heavily in institutional. So when you look at these two and say, well, which one would you more likely to forward on to somebody else? And I think it will probably depend very much so on the audience. But when you think about the diversity of stakeholders that may need to engage with data on a particular project, are there different ways in which you can present, say, data outside of 2D information from outside of a spreadsheet that can make it more engaging? And so we actually thought about this on our side for a case study on interactive data experiences. And we presented, we're going to present here actually a really interesting experiment where, as part of our internal trends report, which is something that falls under my purview and we produce on a monthly basis, it gets sent out to everyone at Chaos. We actually track, amongst other economic indicators, the Architectural Billing Index every month. And we look at this data, and for a year, we produce these reports using essentially an Excel output. And you can see the data there on the left. And after we started to hear about our customers using Enscape to create more interesting visualizations using our software for data, we thought, well, let's give it a try. So we started to produce the same data in Enscape, if you will, as a more interesting form of engagement. And we found when we did that is that we actually had a 800% increase in the average view time for this data. So it went from people just glancing at it in 5 seconds to spending 45 seconds engaging with this data in the reports. So from our perspective, I think this is some pretty fascinating information indicating a real benefit from just taking the same information, presenting it in a different format to increase engagement. So the last thing we want to touch on is gamification. I think if you did a Google trend search, you'd probably find that gamification probably peaked maybe 8 years ago or something like that. But that doesn't mean that the concept isn't sound. So what exactly is gamification? Well, it's the integrating of game elements, things like role play, challenges, say different levels that one can ascend through, reward, into design activities as a mechanism for generating stakeholder feedback. So what would that look like in practice? Well, here's an example where some researchers at Chinese University in Hong Kong actually created a game in VR to solicit community feedback. So this is one in which people could navigate through an environment where you're prompted with a series of questions. And what they found is that this was a better tool for participatory design or eliciting feedback from stakeholders, say, than just your traditional mechanisms of, say, questionnaires and work sessions. And it was interesting to see this because it was one in which it's not just about, say, how do you get people to understand a design, but it's also how do you get them to provide that type of feedback that can feed into a design process. And clearly, this was a successful methodology. But it's a little complicated in some ways to create your overall game just for generating feedback. So there's another tool that's been used, and perhaps one that's very familiar to anyone that has children, which is Minecraft, where it was used through a foundation to engage stakeholders to actually play the role of designers through the game itself and use that as a tool for generating feedback. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Block by Block Foundation, but it's an outstanding group that uses Minecraft to go into various communities and allows for them to look at a space that public space that could benefit from essentially improvement, but uses Minecraft as an opportunity for people to directly design in that space and create the space that they want to see. And obviously Minecraft isn't the perfect modeling environment, but it's one that's incredibly easy to game with, to engage with, and allows for them to take this environment, create a sort of a blank space, if you will, and then the community get in there and actually start to design. And you can see the end result here. This was a project in Kosovo where you were able to actually have a pretty engaged process here, and people had a lot of input. And then you can see that was directly used to form the actual design once using that Minecraft input. So there's always a word of caution about letting clients and stakeholders play architect. But I think that this gamification example shows that with the right tools and the right framing, actually that can be done really successfully, and allows for a high level of data capture from stakeholders and engagement by stakeholders to improve the overall outcome of the design. So as an example on our end, we thought it'd be fun. Maybe Easter's a little bit past, but to show an example that we at Enscape roll out every year, which is our annual Easter egg hunt. And so this is something where we put out on social media and things like that. And so we have a little virtual environment with Easter eggs that are scattered around. So it's a nice example of maybe gamification rolled into a example of how you can get your clients engaged in the design process, and of course, maybe marketing as well. So you can always scan the QR code and see for yourself if you can find all 7 eggs. I actually don't know anyone that's found all the eggs. So there you go. The gauntlet's been thrown. So good luck for those that engage that one. So some final thoughts to make sure we save some time for questions. But one of them is that visualization, it's key to communicating internally and externally. And I think that's one of the things that was really fascinating, particularly in some of those research examples, looking at the design of that garden space I showed in VR, is that it's not just the stakeholders that can benefit, but it's the designers themselves. And both parties can really benefit from visualization. The other thing I think is absolutely key is aligning that the visual content and the way it's presented to the target audience. So maybe VR is not right for everyone. Maybe some people need an AR experience, so they want to look at things through tablets. Maybe they like to have a visualization that's just a really good 2D visualization that they can look up as pinned up on a wall. Everyone needs something slightly different. I think the role of a designer is to be attuned to what's going to work best on a particular project. But I'd also say that sometimes it's worth experimenting a bit. And if you haven't tried VR, it's incredibly easy to do. The headsets are obviously relatively affordable at this point. And with something like Enscape, it really is sort of click one button and you're in VR type solution. So it's something that should certainly be explored. The other thing is something that I've always felt is that design process should be fun. Clients are spending enormous sums of money, a lot of emotional investment in this particular process. So, let them enjoy the process, engage them, let them bring their ideas forward, bring them visualizations that allow for them to be engaged. So that way everyone's having fun and they feel good about spending all that money and the outcome that they're going to get. And then the last thing is that all these tools are accessible. Nothing I showed in this particular presentation is fancy, at least from the examples, some of the research. No one's setting up a gimbal for rats anytime soon, I assume, on this call. But as far as the visualization technology, it's Enscape. It's fairly standard tools. It's being able to use your phone or a relatively inexpensive pair of VR goggles. And so I would say, it's up to you to use them. The tools are there. So just a couple of things on VR, not to overly push that particular topic, but it's one that's of interest, and we know that those that have really invested in it find enormous value. The first thing is that we actually have a questionnaire that's out there. We're always trying to improve our technology, and having the input of stakeholders, of which I count all of you, Enscape stakeholders, that is. I would really encourage you to fill out that questionnaire, whether you're a current Enscape user or not. There's some really valuable data that we're hoping to capture that can influence our product roadmap. And then also how to use VR, just another knowledge base article, some examples from our own customers and how they've successfully used this technology. Nothing terribly complicated. But as always, execution matters, and there's always some little tips, tricks, and hacks that might be of benefit. So here's a last slide before we get to just about the end on all of the various resources, those case studies, so you can check them out for yourself. Links to that block by block foundation from UN Habitat, the Easter egg hunt. You can occupy your kids for hours with that one, I imagine. And then, of course, a link to all the research papers as well that were cited, so you can download those yourself. And, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you can download your own 14-day free trial, and that we will also, of course, be releasing the new 3.5 version of Enscape shortly. So that's coming out in a few weeks. Don't delay, give it a try. I definitely encourage you. So with that, I'll say I could open it up to some Q&A with Paul.
Thank you so much, Roderick. Wow. Incredible amount of information and insight squeezed in there.
Yeah,
I think
I'm almost tired from talking. I had to take a couple extra sips of tea there. Sorry
you did
about
a
that to
great.
the audience.
Oh, you did a great job. I think it was really fun and varied too. I think my favorite was the the site plan, showing how a view from a window can be very different, with the terrain and the.
Yeah, I'm sorry we couldn't use the actual customer example. As you can imagine, permissions are really tough to secure. So we recapitulated everything, but that really was an example. And it was a really good one because, I mean, you think about buying a high-end home, how do you really know what you're getting? And trust us doesn't work in that circumstance. So I thought it was a really good example. I really liked what they did there.
Yeah. It like you say, high stakes, high value. So it's definitely a powerful use case for sure. So yeah, I'm just going to hop over to questions. And we have a whole range, and some of them are quite detailed. Maybe I'll send a couple of them over to you after the event as well, if we don't get through all of them. But one of the most popular questions was a question from Stephanie, and it was about diversity in the entourage.
That's actually where that example came from, interestingly. Now, so I'm assuming diversity can mean a lot of things to different people. Maybe I should ask what the question is first before I go into the story of where that came
Sure.
from.
And so Stephanie says, what is Chaos doing to improve inclusiveness in the entourage? She's seeing a lack of diversity, especially in children and the elderly. And so she's saying that representing her clients is extremely difficult currently. I imagine that this is an issue across many different platforms, but as one of the biggest, it would be great to know what Chaos is kind of doing. She says, would love to see Indigenous individuals represented as well, which is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's particularly interesting for us because being a global company, we have customers just about everywhere. Not Antarctica yet that we know of, but we're keeping an eye out. So diversity, this actually came up with a customer. We had a really great project, and they're using Enscape, but we didn't have the right people for the actual stakeholders. And so they ended up having to create their own custom people that would be in there. And there's a real discordance between the visual quality of the assets that they generated, the entourage that they had to use versus the Enscape visualization. And it really got us thinking, like, this is such a problem that it's better to accept a lower visual quality than the wrong entourage. And it highlights how important having the right people in the visualization is. So here's what we're doing. The first thing is that we have our own scanner, and we bring it to trade shows, at least in Europe. And obviously it's going to be challenging to get all the different types of people that we want. But it gives us a pretty good cross section, at least. So that's something where if you ever see Enscape or Chaos at a trade show, like we were at BAO recently, we had a scanner there. We were scanning people, and we actually have a pretty big tranche of new people that are coming in with 3.5 based off of that. So these are actual people, all walks of life, things like that. They won't get you children, unfortunately, and it really doesn't get you too many elderly because obviously they're not going to these trade shows. So the other thing that we've done is that we're actually making some direct investments in the form of acquisitions or acquisition in the realm of exactly this. And that's something that's it's in the process of negotiation right now, and we're really excited about because it'll be bringing not just people, but really best in class across a wide variety for exactly this purpose. So, Stephanie, sympathize, acknowledge, and absolutely, we're working on it. So, and those are the two tracks that we have.
Super. I think that was really insightful to learn about those approaches, and yeah, great to know that you're scanning real people. So AI is not taking over completely just yet.
Not just yet, no.
But yeah, I think that was a popular question. So great to get to that one. Another very popular question was from Morgan Jacobs. Morgan says many visualizations here are very detailed, the ones that you showed in your examples. We hope to talk about spatial feel during the very beginning of the design process. So can you talk a little more about the early stage use of the software during the concept or the schematic design phases.
Absolutely. So there's two things just off the top of my head that I'll talk about there. The first one is that Enscape has what's referred to as white mode, sort of like a styrofoam mode almost, that allows for the engagement with design. And there's within the context of that, you don't have to have the materials populated. You don't have to necessarily put in assets or anything like that. So it allows for people to very quickly understand, particularly in VR, you still get that sense of scale, even in the context of white mode. And that's actually, I think, what was the interesting thing of that research out of MIT indicated that. So that's one way to do that very early in design, sort of that sugar cube or styrofoam block phase. The other thing that actually is really interesting is we look at what some of our customers do during that very early design phase. And what they actually do is they take that very simplified model, but they still apply their own material. So for instance, we were looking at some work that was done by Renzo Piano, where he actually sort of applied like chipboard material to the Enscape model at that phase. And it looked like a chipboard model. It was the darndest thing. And so you could actually get that same sense of scale. But it wasn't in white mode. It was like going into the chipboard model and like walking around a chipboard model. If you were, was this building for ants? It was kind of like that sort of experience. And I think those are two ways in which we've seen people do it. I think that the very easy way is that like the styrofoam mode, but I think that the more sophisticated way that some of our customers are doing is almost that facsimile model. And I think both of those are quite successful.
Super. Yeah, just one more question on the assets and the entourage. It's have to be the last question, but I'll definitely send over the other questions so that you can answer by email. Nick asks, will Enscape or Chaos, I guess, make assets more customizable, i.e. change asset materials? Wait, the question's jumping around, sorry. Change the asset materials, the texture, the opacity for things like trees and cars.
Oh man, this feels like a softball question because in 3.5 we actually have exactly that. So I definitely give a plug for downloading. We have the preview version of 3.5 is already out now, so they can check that out for themselves. So we're starting down that route in a more sophisticated way, but we're basically we called it parametric assets. We realized that's probably the wrong terminology. So they're sort of assets with variations to do exactly that, right? You might have a chair, change the legs, change the material, change the texture of the materials, say like a car, colors, lights. Their relative color, things like that. Trees, like, oh, this is that same tree with more foliage, less foliage, tree in the fall, tree in the spring, that kind of thing. So that's coming out. And what our idea there is that it's very difficult to generate assets for Enscape. Like all the assets have to work in real time. And so the example I use is kind of like the set on a movie or something where it's like it looks good from the front, but behind it, there's nothing there. And that takes actually a lot of artistry to generate. So all of our assets are ones that have a high degree of human touch. And so we found that creating this variation or assets of variations methodology is one we can vastly expand our asset library without having to go through that full modeling process. That's really a bottleneck for new assets in our software. So what you see now in 3.5 is just a start. It's going from there. But as always, we look for feedback actually, and I wish I had put in a link. I should have. We actually have a public-facing product board that probably if you Google it, you can find it. And there's a place where you can actually vote on various features, including this, for VR support, all sorts of stuff. And we definitely encourage people to take advantage of that as well.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Yeah, I think the best advice is definitely to play with the software. Get yourself a free trial. I think some people have been asking for it, and you can either use the link in the chat, or if you are having trouble with that, you can definitely email Enscape directly, Gemma, in the chat. And I think also Enscape will be following up with an email as well with more information and links and things like that. So nobody panic, you'll get your links.
Not to worry. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Roderick, and thank you so much to everyone in the audience. Somebody asked, is my background VR? It's not VR, but it's definitely not real. So, in case anyone's been wondering about that for the last number of months, I've been doing events here. But yeah. it was an incredibly educational talk, and yeah, it would be great to do another one, a follow up, to talk about all the updates that are coming, and yeah, see how things progress with the integration of VR and everything.
Absolutely, and maybe one last thing I'd say is that we're going to be at AI National in San Francisco. We have something really, really exciting that we'll be showing people there. Sort of a little private, but come by the booth, and we'll be having some sort of private sessions and be able to take a sort of peek behind the curtain and show you what's up. So, like I say, it has me excited. So
that's awesome. Yeah. Hands-on demonstration. So anybody that's heading there, make sure you keep an eye out for the Enscape booth for sure. Thanks so much, Roderick, and thank you again to the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone. An hour of everyone's time is not a small ask, so we really appreciate it.
Really appreciate it, and see you at the next one very soon. Bye, everyone. Bye, Roderick.